Emily tore through the opulent hotel hallways, a frantic whirlwind in a pastel bridesmaid dress. One hand clutched the hem of her gown. The other flailed as she navigated treacherous heels that, moments ago, had seemed like a chic accessory, but now felt like instruments of torture designed for ankle shattering. Her simple plan, arrive early, lend a hand with preparations, and shine as the perfectly punctual bridesmaid, had, of course, been utterly derailed. The universe, it seemed, had declared today the ultimate test of her patience. First, the taxi was inexplicably late. Then, a maniacal driver nearly flattened her at the hotel entrance. And, as a grand finale, the elevator, her express route to the ballroom, was impossibly crammed, leaving her no option but to sprint up what felt like 100 flights of stairs. If there were an Oscar for clumsiest bridesmaid in history, Emily was a shoo-in for the win. "Sorry. So sorry," she mumbled, ricocheting off bewildered guests like a human pinball. Just a few more steps. The low hum of voices from inside the ballroom reached her, a clear signal that the ceremony was moments from commencing. And then, it happened. Bam! Emily collided with something, or rather, someone, solid. The impact was so jarring that her carefully arranged bouquet soared through the air, her purse clattered to the floor, and she found herself teetering precariously, just an inch from an unwelcome kiss with the hotel's expensive carpet. But before she could complete her embarrassing descent, a pair of incredibly strong hands closed around her waist, steadying her, preventing an outright catastrophe. A wave of expensive cologne washed over her, an intoxicating scent that momentarily obliterated all other thoughts, even her own name. "Oh, please tell me I didn't just run over an elderly man," she mumbled, fighting to regain her equilibrium, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'm definitely not an elderly man." The deep, slow cadence of his voice made Emily blink once, twice, before finally, hesitantly, lifting her gaze to the man whose hand still held her. She nearly choked. What kind of cruel genetic injustice was this? The man standing before her looked as though he'd stepped directly off the pages of a high-end fashion magazine. Dark hair immaculately styled, eyes an unsettlingly piercing blue, and an undeniable aura of someone utterly accustomed to being in charge. His expression, a captivating mix of curiosity and subtle amusement, only intensified her mortification. "You're late," he observed, a slight quirk to his lips. Emily's eyes widened. Great. He was observant, too. "Oh, thank you, Captain Obvious," she retorted, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Any other brilliant facts you'd like to share?" A corner of his lips lifted further, a hint of a genuine smile. But Emily had no time for flirting, nor for dissecting just how ridiculously attractive that nascent smirk was. She attempted a quick retreat, but a stubborn tug on her dress halted her. Looking down, her humiliation spiked. The delicate fabric was hopelessly snagged on her own heel. "Oh, fantastic," she muttered under her breath. "Because merely tripping wasn't enough, I had to get stuck too." The man, with a disconcerting lack of urgency, crouched down, his movements fluid and precise. With a swift, practiced motion, he freed the trapped fabric. "You may now continue your suicide mission," he remarked, a dry amusement in his tone. Just as she finally thought she could make her escape, he added, "I was already on my way, by the way. I hope you have life insurance because at this pace, I doubt you'll make it past the buffet." Emily rolled her eyes so hard they almost vanished into her head. Scooping up her bouquet and purse from the floor, she took off again, not daring to glance back. Yet even amidst the chaotic rush, His deep voice seemed to echo in her mind, a strange, persistent whisper. "Don't look at him." "Don't look at him," Emily repeated to herself, a silent mantra, as she finally slipped into her designated spot among the bridesmaids. The ceremony was already in full swing, and Clara, the bride and her best friend, shot her a dagger-eyed glare that could curdle milk. But Emily's focus was irretrievably drawn to the imposing figure seated among the groomsmen, the very man from her earlier disastrous collision. He was right there, front and center, watching her again with that unsettlingly assessing gaze. "Who is that?" she whispered to the bridesmaid beside her, nudging her discreetly. "That's Brian Fisher," her friend murmured back, a hint of awe in her voice. "And why, pray tell?" "Should I know who he is?" Emily retorted, a touch of exasperation in her tone. "Because," the bridesmaid leaned in, "he's one of the richest men in the country, the CEO of one of the world's biggest financial consulting firms." Emily blinked, her mind struggling to process the information. "Oh, of course," she deadpanned, a wry smile playing on her lips. "Makes perfect sense that a billionaire spends his time saving clumsy bridesmaids in hotel hallways." Her friend stifled a quiet laugh. "He's a mystery, though," the bridesmaid continued, lowering her voice further. "Cold, calculating, never gets involved with anyone. They say he can end anyone's career with just one phone call." Emily swallowed hard, a sudden chill running down her spine. Great. Not only had she nearly knocked him over, but she had also been incredibly rude to him. She closed her eyes, taking a deep, calming breath. All right, the wedding was happening. She just needed to survive the ceremony, avoid any more disasters, and most importantly, stop looking at Brian Fisher. Except, when she opened her eyes again, he was still watching her. And then, slowly, deliberately, he raised an eyebrow, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. A shiver traced its way down Emily's spine. Something told her this night was just beginning. Emily had never been the kind of person who got intimidated easily, yet, at that moment, sitting stiffly among the other bridesmaids and desperately trying to focus on the solemnity of the ceremony, she could feel the oppressive weight of that gaze on her. Brian Fisher. She didn't need to actually look to know he was still watching. She could feel it, an almost tangible pressure. It was as if the entire room had faded away, leaving only that singular, intense, and utterly enigmatic presence. "You've been playing with your hair for 5 minutes straight," the bridesmaid next to her whispered, pulling Emily abruptly back to reality. Emily's hand dropped immediately, her face flushing crimson. "Have I?" she mumbled. "Yes. And guess what?" her friend added, a playful smirk on her lips. "He's still looking at you." Emily closed her eyes for a second, groaning internally. Great. Just what I needed. Why would a billionaire CEO be interested in staring at me? I'm just an architect who almost knocked him over. Her friend merely shrugged. Who knows? Maybe he likes a challenge. Emily sighed, trying once more to concentrate on the ceremony. But even as the bride and groom exchanged their heartfelt vows and the guests let out sentimental sighs, she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling of being watched. The wedding reception was in full swing. The grand ballroom glowed with warm golden lights, soft music filled the air, and guests mingled happily between elegantly decorated tables, while waiters gracefully glided by carrying trays laden with champagne flutes. Emily tried to remain focused on her bridesmaid duties, helping Clara, ensuring the bride was comfortable, and above all, avoiding any further embarrassing mishaps. But the universe, as always, seemed to have other plans. As She reached for a glass of wine from a passing waiter's tray. Turning too quickly, she collided with something solid once again. The dark liquid splashed. Time froze. She held her breath, watching the disaster unfold in agonizing, slow motion. A crimson stain blossomed across the pristine fabric of a black suit. Emily's eyes shot upwards in horror, meeting Brian Fisher's piercing blue gaze, now fixed intently on her. "Tell me this didn't just happen," she whispered, still clutching the empty glass. Brian glanced down at his shirt, then back at her, his expression unreadable. "Well," he stated calmly, "it did." Emily swallowed hard. I'll grab a napkin." "No. Wait. I can clean—" Before she could finish, he calmly removed his jacket, rolling up his sleeves with an easy grace. "Relax. It's just wine." She blinked, surprised. "You're not going to sue me or throw me out of the party?" The corner of his mouth lifted ever so slightly. "Not yet. But if you'd like to make it up to me, you could join me at the bar." Emily blinked again. Was that an invitation? More like an attempt at— "Depends on your answer," he finished, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. She glanced around, instinctively searching for an escape route. But the truth was, despite everything, there was something about him that intrigued her. Maybe it was his unwavering calm, the quiet confidence in his voice. Maybe it was the way his gaze always seemed to study her with silent, unwavering interest. Or maybe, just maybe, it was sheer, unadulterated curiosity. "Okay," she conceded, a small smile forming. "But I get to choose the drinks." Brian nodded towards the bar, a challenge in his eyes. "Surprise me." The ballroom's bar was luxurious but quiet at that moment. Only a few scattered guests occupied the counter, making the space feel surprisingly intimate. Emily settled onto one of the high stools, crossing her arms over her chest. "I should order something ridiculously expensive," she mused, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Just to see your reaction." Brian tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You think I'd care about the price of a drink?" "That's exactly why it would be fun." He chuckled, a low, rich sound that sent a small shiver tracing its way down her spine. Brian Fisher, laughing. Now, that was a rare sight. The bartender approached, and Emily, without hesitation, placed her order. "2 shots of whiskey, please." Brian's eyebrow arched in a subtle display of surprise. "Impressive." She shrugged. "Did you think I'd order a fruit cocktail?" "I think you like to surprise people," he corrected. The whiskey arrived, and she picked up her glass, swirling the amber liquid for a moment. "So, Brian Fisher," she turned to him, a small smile playing on her lips. "Why is a high-powered CEO at a wedding that clearly doesn't fit his reserved style?" He swirled his own drink before answering, his gaze fixed on the glass. "Because I'm the groom's best man. And because your social life consists of boring corporate events." Brian laughed again, a genuine unforced sound, and Emily felt an odd sense of satisfaction. "Maybe," she admitted. "But, what about you?" "I'm the maid of honor, which means I'm here out of duty. Not choice." "And yet you seem to be enjoying yourself," he observed, his eyes twinkling. She took a slow sip of whiskey, feeling the warmth slide down her throat. "Well," she mused, "the night got a lot more interesting after I spilled wine on the guest of honor and almost knocked him over in the hallway." Emily rolled her eyes playfully. "You're never going to let that go, are you?" "Probably not." A comfortable silence fell between them for a moment. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt awkward or strained. It was the kind that carried something unspoken, something lingering just beneath the surface. Growing slowly. Emily looked away, pretending to focus intently on her drink. So, do you always look at people like that? Brian smirked, his eyes still fixed on her. Like what? Like you're trying to figure them out, she clarified. Only when I think it's worth the effort. Emily's heart skipped a beat. What was happening here? She took a deep breath and downed the rest of her whiskey in one go. This was fun, but I have to get back to the bride. Brian didn't try to stop her. He just watched as she stood up, his gaze still fixed on her. See you around, Emily. She hesitated for a second, then gave a small, hesitant smile. See you around, Mr. Fisher. But as she walked away, she had a feeling this wouldn't be their last conversation. The wedding reception was still lively, a buzzing symphony of laughter and music, but Emily felt that something inside her had subtly shifted after that conversation with Brian Fisher. Something she couldn't quite define, but that made her heart beat a little faster than usual. She walked back to the bridesmaid's table and picked up a glass of champagne, trying to ignore the undeniable fact that just a few feet away, Brian was still watching her. So? Clara's voice chirped beside her, laced with a teasing smile. I saw you and the mysterious groomsman had an interesting moment at the bar. Emily rolled her eyes. It was just casual conversation. Nothing special. Nothing special? Clara raised an eyebrow, a skeptical glint in her eyes. Emily, that man couldn't take his eyes off you during the ceremony, and now, even from across the room, he's still looking. Emily let out a nervous laugh, taking a quick sip of her drink. You're exaggerating. He's just intriguing. Intriguing? Clara chuckled, shaking her head. Emily, that man is one of the most powerful billionaires in the country, and from what people say, he doesn't get involved with anyone. If he's interested in you, it's because he sees something different. Emily shrugged, but she couldn't hide the blush that was steadily rising to her cheeks. He just likes analyzing people, that's all. And honestly, I'm just an ordinary architect. There's no reason for someone like him to notice me. Clara sighed, shaking her head knowingly. Oh, you really don't see it, do you? Before Emily could respond, one of the groomsmen approached, asking Clara for a dance, leaving Emily alone again. But not for long. Are you going to keep pretending you haven't noticed? We've been looking at each other for hours? Emily closed her eyes for a second, a sigh escaping her lips, before slowly turning around. Brian was there. Too close. His presence commanding. I wasn't looking at you, Emily said. Emily, and sao aswidi, trying to sound as indifferent as possible. Brian tilted his head slightly, studying her with that intense gaze that made her heart race uncontrollably. You're really bad at lying, aren't you? Emily crossed her arms, letting out a sarcastic laugh. And are you always like this? Or do you just enjoy making people uncomfortable? The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. I like to observe, to understand how people react. And so far, you've been an interesting surprise. Good for you. Now, if you'll excuse me, she tried to step away, but Brian gently took her wrist, just enough to make her stop. Dance with me. Emily's eyes widened. What? One dance. That's all. She looked at the dance floor, where couples were already moving to the soft music. Then she turned back to him. And what if I say no? I'd say you're lying again. Emily bit her lower lip, fighting the smile that threatened to break through. You're unbearably arrogant, you know that? Brian took a step back, extending his hand. "And yet you're still here considering my offer." Emily took a deep breath. What harm could it do? She placed her hand in his, and as Brian led her to the dance floor, Emily felt as if the world around them had simply disappeared. His arms wrapped around her waist with quiet confidence, while his firm hand held hers. "You've done this before?" Emily commented, trying to ignore their alarming closeness. "Danced a few times, but not like this." He lifted his eyes, meeting hers up close. "And what's different this time?" Brian studied her for a moment, his gaze intense, before finally answering. "You." A shiver ran through Emily's skin. The room was full, buzzing with energy, but in that moment it felt like only the two of them existed. And for the first time that night, she let herself stop avoiding his gaze. Because deep down, she knew something was happening here, something she couldn't ignore. And maybe she didn't even want to. Emily wasn't sure what was happening. Well, she knew she was dancing with Brian Fisher, the most reserved, intimidating, and apparently persistent man she'd ever met. But at the same time, she didn't know why it felt so incredibly natural. The ballroom was packed, a swirl of elegant dresses and sharp suits. But everything around them blurred as he led her across the floor with effortless precision. She had never realized how much she truly liked dancing until that moment. Or perhaps it was simply the fact that Brian seemed to know exactly how to hold her hand, how to touch her waist, how to make every single move feel light, effortless. "You're surprised?" His deep voice resonated near her ear, sending another shiver down her spine. "Should I be?" she retorted, narrowing her eyes at him. "You didn't expect me to know how to dance?" "No, I didn't. But I guess it makes sense. I bet you learned this the same way you learned everything else in life, because you needed to keep up appearances." Brian smirked, a mysterious glint in his eyes. "Are you always this direct?" "Only when I'm genuinely curious." "Then tell me, Emily, what else makes you curious?" Emily opened her mouth to respond, but his gaze, intense and unwavering, threw her off balance. For a second, she completely forgot what she was going to say. "That's not fair." "What isn't?" "You distracting me with those eyes and expecting me to form a coherent sentence." Brian let out a low chuckle, a rich, warm sound. "It's not my fault you get distracted so easily." She sighed and decided to try and step away, but as soon as she took a step back, Brian caught her hand. "Already? Running away?" Emily raised an eyebrow, a defiant glint in her eyes. "I don't run away." He studied her for a moment, a challenge in his gaze. "Then prove it." Emily crossed her arms. "How?" He hesitated for a second, then, his voice smooth and confident, he said, "Meet me for coffee tomorrow." Emily hesitated. The idea of seeing Brian again the very next day was incredibly tempting, yet also undeniably risky. Luckily for her, the music ended right at that precise moment, and she slowly stepped away as if nothing particularly significant had happened. Brian just stood there, watching her with a subtle, knowing smile. The party was winding down. Guests were starting to say their goodbyes. The bride and groom were busy with the last well-wishers, and Emily felt it was the right time to leave. It had been a long day, and her mind was a whirlwind of scattered thoughts, dominated by one particular, infuriatingly attractive CEO. She walked out of the ballroom, heading towards the hotel entrance where the guests' cars were parked. Pulling out her phone to call a ride-share, a notification popped up on the screen. "No drivers available at the moment." Great. She took a deep breath, considering waiting a little longer when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Looks like your escape plan failed?" Emily slowly turned around and found Brian Fisher standing next to her, hands in his suit pockets, with that unnervingly observant look that unsettled her. "I'm not running away. I'm just going home. Without a ride, that's just a detail." Brian tilted his head slightly, as if analyzing the situation. Then, without a moment's hesitation, he said, "I'll take you." Emily frowned. "You what?" "I'll drive you home. It's late, and I don't think it's safe for a woman to be waiting alone at this hour." She crossed her arms, a hint of defiance in her posture. "I can take care of myself." "I never said you couldn't," he countered smoothly. "But why wait when I'm already leaving?" Emily bit her lip. Accepting a ride from Brian felt wrong for so many reasons. First, being in a car with him meant there'd be no escape from his teasing. Second, there was something about him that made her heart race in a strange, exhilarating way. She glanced at the app again, hoping a driver would magically appear, but the screen stayed stubbornly the same. "Fine," she finally said, her voice laced with reluctant acceptance. "But only because I have no other option." Brian didn't respond. He simply opened the car door, a silent invitation for her to get in. Emily took a deep breath and settled into the passenger seat. As soon as he got in and started the engine, silence filled the car. And it was a heavy silence. The city lights flickered through the windows as they drove. Emily fidgeted with her fingers, unsure if she should start a conversation or just wait for the ride to be over. Brian, on the other hand, seemed perfectly comfortable with the quiet. "Do you always drive alone?" she finally asked, just to break the tension. He glanced at her briefly before answering. "I like driving at night, helps me think." "Oh, so you do think," she teased, raising an eyebrow. Brian let out a small smile. One of those fleeting ones that did more damage than they should. "You don't think I do?" "I think you're a mystery." "And does that bother you?" Emily hesitated for a second before answering. "I think so." "Why?" "Because you have this intimidating energy, like you're always in control, like nothing ever shakes you." Brian was quiet for a few seconds, as if carefully considering her words. Then, without taking his eyes off the road, he said calmly, "You have no idea the effect you have on people." Emily's eyes widened as she turned to look at him. "What?" He didn't answer right away, just kept that mysterious half-smile, his fingers relaxed on the steering wheel. "You talk as if I'm the only hard-to-read person in this conversation," he continued. "But, Emily, I don't think you realize how much you draw people's attention." She looked away, feeling something unexpected rise in her chest. It was just a casual comment, or maybe it wasn't. The car stopped at a red light, and Brian turned his head towards her, his gaze unsettlingly direct. "You feel uncomfortable around me because you think I analyze you too much. But the truth is, you intrigue me, and I like understanding the things that intrigue me." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She wasn't sure whether to be annoyed by his blatant boldness or flattered by it. The rest of the drive to Emily's apartment was quiet, but not in an awkward way. It was the kind of silence filled with unspoken thoughts, as if both of them were processing what had just happened. When Brian pulled up in front of her building, Emily let out a quiet sigh of relief. She was grateful to finally be home, yet at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had transpired between them that night. She turned to him, feeling the undeniable need to say something before leaving. "Thank you for the ride." Brian tilted his head slightly, his eyes studying her in a way that made her heart race. "It was my pleasure, Emily." She hesitated, something in his voice sending a shiver down her spine. Not wanting to linger in that strange, charged feeling, she opened the car door and stepped out, carefully closing it behind her. As she climbed the steps to the entrance, she suddenly felt the urge to look back. And when she did, she saw Brian, still there, watching her. Emily quickly looked away and walked inside. The moment the elevator doors closed behind her, she leaned against the wall and let out the breath she had been holding. What just happened? The next morning, Emily walked into the construction firm's office, balancing a cup of coffee in one hand and a few reports in the other. After a weekend spent trying valiantly not to think about Brian Fisher, she was determined to go back to her normal routine. But something inside her felt restless, an unusual hum beneath the surface. She had convinced herself she would never see him again. After all, he was a billionaire CEO who moved in circles of high-profile investors and boardroom meetings, while she was an architect focused on her projects. Their worlds had no reason to cross again, or so she thought. Emily stepped into the conference room, holding a folder with project documents in one hand and her coffee in the other. Her colleagues were already there, chatting amongst themselves, while Oliver Harris, the firm's director, flipped through some pages about the Richmond Tower, the company's most ambitious project to date. She took her seat, settling in for another one of those long technical meetings. But as soon as she lifted her eyes to see who was sitting at the head of the table, her heart plummeted. Brian Fisher. He was there, dressed in a flawless suit, his serious and analytical gaze scanning the documents as if this were just another ordinary business deal. Emily froze. No, this cannot be happening. As if sensing her presence, Brian lifted his eyes slowly, and for a brief, suspended moment, the world stood still. Her blue eyes met his, and it was as if the air in the room suddenly became heavier. But to her complete shock, Brian remained utterly composed and simply greeted her in a neutral, professional tone. "Miss Carter," Emily blinked, nearly dropping her coffee. "Is he pretending this is normal?" Noticing the awkward silence, Oliver quickly stepped in. "Emily, this is Brian Fisher, our new lead investor for the Richmond Tower project." Her stomach twisted into a knot. "What?" "Mr. Fisher and his investment firm have acquired a significant stake in the project's funding," Oliver continued, oblivious to Emily's internal turmoil. "He'll be our strategic partner moving forward." Emily looked from Brian to Oliver, then to her colleagues, realizing that no one else seemed even remotely surprised by this news. No one, except her. Brian said nothing. He just watched calmly as she processed the bombshell that had just dropped. Emily took a deep breath and forced a professional smile onto her face. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Fisher." "Thank you," he replied, offering a slight, almost imperceptible smile. But his eyes said something else entirely. After the meeting, Emily was determined to get out of there as fast as possible. She needed air, a minute to process what had just happened. But of course Brian Fisher wasn't going to let that happen. She had barely stepped out of the conference room when she heard his voice behind her. "Emily." She closed her eyes for a second, a silent groan escaping her, before slowly turning around. "What is it?" Brian studied her, crossing his arms. His perfectly tailored suit only added to his effortlessly commanding presence. "No friendlier greeting?" she scoffed, folding her arms as well. "Are you my boss now?" "Not exactly, but we'll have to work together." Emily felt her throat go dry. "Did you already know?" Brian tilted his head slightly, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "I found out the moment I saw your name on the project team." And you didn't think that would be awkward? I thought it would be interesting. Emily let out a disbelieving laugh. Oh, so now fate is a game to you? I'd say fate has a peculiar sense of humor. She narrowed her eyes, a spark of challenge in them. Or maybe you manipulated it. Brian smiled slowly, a knowing glint in his eyes. You're giving me too much credit, Emily. She wasn't sure if she wanted to run away or throw her coffee at him. But one thing she knew for sure. There was no escaping this anymore. The Horizon construction office was completely silent, save for the rapid tap of computer keys and the rustle of turning pages. Emily stared intently at the documents on her desk, trying to ignore the magnetic presence of Brian Fisher, who was sitting in a chair on the other side of the meeting room. After the shocking revelation that he was one of the main investors in the Richmond Tower project, she had no choice but to face reality. They would have to work together for the next few months, and Brian, it seemed, was enjoying that fact a little too much. Do you always frown like that when you're focused? His deep voice interrupted her thoughts, calm and smooth. Emily clenched her teeth before looking up. Do you always ask random questions when you should be working? Brian tilted his head, a slight smile playing on his lips. Only when I'm trying to understand someone. Emily crossed her arms, instantly suspicious. And why do you want to understand me? He leaned, his elbows on the table, watching, her with that intense gaze that made her stomach churn. Because you intrigue me, Emily. She didn't know how to respond. She felt her face heat up, so she quickly looked back at the papers, pretending to be utterly engrossed. But Brian didn't stop there. Let's go to dinner. Emily blinked, surprised. What? We need to go over the project details. It'll be more productive than staying late at the office. So this isn't really an invitation, she clarified, a hint of suspicion in her voice. It's just a way to make me work overtime. If that makes it easier to accept, then yes. Emily sighed, knowing she didn't have much choice. Fine, but I get to pick the restaurant. Brian smiled, and for some reason, it gave her butterflies. The restaurant was small and cozy, a complete contrast to the fancy, Michelin-starred places Emily imagined Brian usually frequented. You really brought me to a place this simple? He asked, looking around with a hint of amusement. I'm a woman of simple tastes, Mr. Fisher. He chuckled, picking up the menu. And you think a CEO like me wouldn't enjoy this? I think CEOs like you only know menus, with unpronounceable names and dishes that cost half my salary. Brian raised an amused eyebrow. You might be right, but it's always good to try new things. Emily shook her head, laughing softly. If you still say that after tasting the food here, then I'll believe you. As they ordered, Emily noticed that for the first time since they started working together, Brian seemed more relaxed. The usual tension between them was still subtly there. But there was something different about the way he spoke, a genuine curiosity, as if he was truly enjoying the moment. Now tell me, he started, resting his arms on the table. Why architecture? Emily hesitated. What do you mean? Was this always your dream? She shrugged. Since I was a kid, I always liked creating things, transforming spaces. Architecture gives me the chance to change people's lives. Brian nodded, seeming genuinely interested. And have you? Emily smiled, remembering one of her first projects. There was a client once, an elderly woman who wanted to remodel her home to accommodate her grandson, who had been in an accident and was now paralyzed. When we finished the project, she cried. She said it would change his life. Brian was silent for a moment, a thoughtful expression on his face, before finally saying, "That's admirable." She laughed softly. "Don't compliment me like that, Mr. Fisher. I'm used to you challenging me at work." "Maybe I just like seeing you annoyed." Emily felt her face warm up. "You're impossible. And yet, you're still here." The waiter brought their food, cutting the moment short. Emily quickly grabbed her utensils, trying to ignore the undeniable fact that Brian was right. She was still there, and she was enjoying it more than she should. Hours later, it was late when they left the restaurant. The city lights illuminated the streets, and the cool night air was a welcome relief after the warmth inside. "Are you sleepy?" Brian asked as they walked towards the car. "Not really, but if you're planning to take me back to the office, I'll pretend I am." He laughed. "Not at all. It's a nice night. Let's take a walk." Emily raised an eyebrow. Brian Fisher, wandering around with no clear purpose. "That's new. You said it's good to say, didn't you?" She rolled her eyes, but didn't refuse. They strolled slowly through the quiet streets. No rush, just watching the city lights and talking about random mundane things. Emily never would have imagined Brian being this relaxed, this normal. "Have you always been like this?" she asked suddenly. "Like what? Reserved? Cold?" Brian looked thoughtful, his gaze distant for a moment. "Life has taught me to be cautious, but that doesn't mean I don't feel anything." She hadn't expected that answer. Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence filled with something unspoken, something profoundly human. Emily glanced at him and realized that for the first time, Brian Fisher seemed utterly vulnerable, utterly human, and that was dangerous. Very dangerous. Emily woke up that morning with her mind in a haze. She was still processing the night before. The dinner, the unexpectedly easy conversation, and the undeniable fact that against all logic, she had actually enjoyed being with Brian Fisher. That wasn't good. That wasn't what should be happening. She got up quickly, as if keeping busy could somehow push the intrusive thoughts away. She needed to work. She needed to focus on the Richmond Tower project, and more importantly, she needed to keep her distance from Brian. But as soon as she walked into the Horizon construction office, she realized that wouldn't be so easy. Brian was already in the conference room when Emily arrived. He was sitting at the head of the table, his expression calm and focused on the documents in front of him, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened between them the night before. She hesitated before stepping in, took a deep breath, and walked forward. "Good morning," she said, forcing a formality she didn't feel. Brian looked up at her and gave a small smile. "Good morning, Emily. Did you sleep well?" She clenched her teeth. He knew exactly what he was doing. "Perfectly," she lied, her voice tight. Brian nodded, clearly amused by her terse response. The rest of the team started arriving, and the meeting began. Emily forced herself to focus on the technical details of the project, the structural adjustments, and the budget. But ignoring his presence was impossible. Every now and then, she felt his gaze on her, and every time it happened, her heartbeat quickened. But she wouldn't let it show. After an intense hour-long meeting, the team started to disperse. Emily gathered her notes and stood up, ready to make a swift exit before Brian could say anything. But just as she turned to go, he called out, "Emily!" She froze for a second, then forced herself to look completely indifferent before turning to face him. "Yes?" Brian closed his folder and stood up, adjusting his jacket with an effortless motion. "I need to discuss a few project decisions with you." Emily took a deep breath. This is work. Just work. Okay. Can we do it now? Of course, he said, picking up his coffee and motioning for her to follow him. They walked to the office. Balcony. A quiet, secluded space often used for informal meetings. The morning sun lit up the city below, creating a sharp contrast with the palpable tension hanging in the air between them. Emily leaned against the railing and crossed her arms. What exactly do you want to talk about? Brian studied her for a moment, his gaze unwavering, before answering softly. Last night. She stiffened. Instantly. Last night? Yes. Emily narrowed her eyes. I thought we were here to talk about the project. Brian gave her that small, dangerously charming smile. We can talk about both. She huffed. Look, Brian, what happened last night was a work dinner. That's all. Are you sure? Emily opened her mouth to respond, but something in his expression made her hesitate. She wasn't sure, and he knew it, which was exactly why she decided to end the conversation right there. I have to go, she said, turning to leave. Brian watched her for a moment before saying something that made her stop in her tracks. You're pulling away on purpose. A shiver ran down her spine. This has nothing to do with you. Yes, it does. She turned to him, annoyed. Why do you think everything revolves around you? Brian took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them, making the air crackle. Because I know this game, Emily. She held her breath. And what game is that? The game of distance. You're pushing me away because you feel something you don't want to admit. Emily's stomach twisted. You're completely wrong. Brian tilted his head slightly, as if analyzing her every reaction. Then look me in the eye and tell me you didn't feel anything last night. Emily swallowed hard. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to say that none of it meant anything, but deep down she knew that would be a lie. And the problem was, Brian knew it too. The silence between them was heavy, filled with something neither of them wanted to name. Finally, Emily took a step back. This doesn't matter. I have work to do. And she walked away before he could say anything else. But as she left, she felt a weight in her chest because she knew that sooner or later she wouldn't be able to run anymore. Emily spent the rest of the day trying to ignore the conversation with Brian on the balcony, trying to convince herself that he was wrong, that she didn't feel anything. Or at least, that's what she kept telling herself. But as the hours passed, ignoring the truth became harder and harder. The tension between them had been growing since Clara's wedding. At first she tried to dismiss it as nothing more than a bit of teasing, a game of provocations that meant nothing. But now his presence unsettled her in a way she could no longer deny. And Brian knew it. At the end of the workday, Emily gathered her things and headed to the office kitchen, needing a moment to breathe before going home. She grabbed a glass of water and leaned against the counter, closing her eyes for a few seconds. That's when she felt someone standing beside her. She knew exactly who it was before even opening her eyes. You're avoiding me again. Brian's voice was low, controlled. But there was something deeper beneath it, an undercurrent of something she couldn't quite decipher. Emily took a deep breath before turning to face him. I'm not avoiding you. I'm just trying to work without distractions. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. So now I'm a distraction? You always have been. The words slipped out before she could stop them. The moment she realized what she had just said, her face grew warm, a deep blush creeping up her neck. but Brian only gave a slight smile, as if he had been expecting that answer all along. "Finally," he said, his voice dropping even lower, rich with an unspoken meaning. Emily crossed her arms. "Finally, what?" "You're finally admitting it." She let out a frustrated breath, looking away, her gaze fixed somewhere over his shoulder. "I'm not admitting anything." "Yes, you are." He took a step closer, and suddenly the air around them felt warmer, charged. "Emily, you can keep pretending this isn't happening, but we both know it is." She swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. "You want to know what's happening, Brian? I don't have time for this." He didn't look surprised. He just studied her for a moment before replying, his voice steady. "You have time for everything except admitting how you feel." Emily closed her eyes for a second, a silent plea for composure. This was a dangerous game. This can't happen. Why not? She opened her eyes and met his gaze, defiance battling with a terrifying honesty in her expression. "Because we work together." Brian's smile was slow, deliberate. And in that moment, Emily knew he wasn't going to give up easily. "And what if we didn't?" She held her breath. Brian leaned in slightly, close enough that she could feel his presence, like a storm about to break. "Tell me, Emily, if I weren't your investor, if you weren't so caught up in these rules and boundaries, what would you do?" Emily couldn't answer, because deep down, she already knew, and Brian did too. The silence between them stretched, heavy, with something undeniable. Finally, Emily took a step back, breaking the powerful moment. "I have to go." Brian didn't stop her. He just watched as she walked away. And the moment Emily stepped through the door, she knew nothing would ever be the same again. The next day, Emily tried to stick to her routine after the intense confrontation with Brian in the Horizon construction office kitchen. But the truth was, nothing felt normal anymore. The tension between them was palpable, a constant hum in the background of her thoughts, and she knew that sooner or later she'd have to make a decision. But what kind of decision? She wasn't sure. Deep down, there was a rebellious voice inside her that wanted to just let it happen, to see where this unexpected connection might lead, but reason, as always, won out. Working with Brian meant that any involvement between them would lead to complications. Professionalism, ethics, reputation. There was too much at stake. So she decided that keeping her distance was the safest, best option. But Brian Fisher wasn't the kind of man who took no easily. It was nearly midnight when Emily finally managed to disconnect from work. After reviewing some late blueprints for the Richmond Tower project, she took a quick shower and collapsed onto the couch, utterly exhausted. Her thoughts were a mess, a jumbled tangle of deadlines and undeniable attractions. She needed a distraction. Then her phone vibrated. She reached for it, expecting some random notification, but her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name on the screen. Brian Fisher. She hesitated before opening the message. "Brian, I need to talk to you. It's important." Emily closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to simply bury her head in the sand. But the other part, the one completely out of control lately, needed to know what he wanted. "Is this about the project?" she typed back, trying to keep her tone detached. "No." Her throat went dry. "Then it can wait until tomorrow." She locked her phone before he could reply and leaned her head against the back of the couch, feeling mentally drained. But the truth was, she knew this wouldn't end here, and she was right. The next morning, when she arrived at the office, Emily immediately noticed that Brian seemed even more intense than usual. He didn't try to talk to her directly, but his eyes said everything he wanted to say, and that made her nervous. During the project meeting, Brian made a point of provoking her whenever he could, challenging her ideas, questioning her proposals, creating an atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. By the time it was finally over, Emily was so frustrated that she decided she wouldn't just let it slide. As soon as the other employees left, she walked up to him. "Can we talk?" she asked, keeping her voice firm. Brian closed his folder and looked at her with that calm expression, but one full of hidden intentions. Of course. They walked into an empty meeting room. Emily closed the door behind her and crossed her arms. "What was that?" "What was what?" Brian replied, as if he had no idea what she was talking about. "The constant provocation during the meeting. Are you testing my limits?" He tilted his head slightly, as if studying her every move. "And if I am?" Emily huffed, irritated. "What do you want, Brian?" He stepped closer, and Emily felt her heart race. "You know what I want." She swallowed hard. "This can't happen." "Why not?" Because it's complicated. Everything in life is complicated, Emily." She felt her patience running out. "Brian, we work together. That's already a huge problem." He didn't answer right away. He just watched her for a few seconds, his intense gaze holding hers, before finally saying something that changed everything. "What if I told you I'm leaving the project?" Emily's eyes widened. "What?" Brian took a deep breath. "I'm transferring my share in the Richmond Tower to another investor." Emily felt her stomach twist, a sickening lurch. "This is crazy." "Why?" He gave her a slight smile, a gentle, almost tender curve of his lips. "Because now there's no reason for you to keep running away." She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You can't just walk away from an investment because of this." "I can do whatever I want, Emily. And what I want is you." The silence was deafening, suffocating. Emily didn't know what to say. Everything she had been trying to avoid, all the excuses she had used to push him away, were gone now. And that scared her more than anything. She needed to get out of there. I need some time to think." Brian simply nodded, his gaze intense, unwavering. "Think, Emily. But think carefully." She left the room quickly, her heart pounding in her chest, a frantic drumbeat. But deep down, she knew she wouldn't be able to run for much longer. Emily walked out of the meeting room feeling like the ground beneath her was crumbling. Brian Fisher had actually done it. He gave up a multi-million-dollar investment because of her. His words kept echoing in her head, a persistent, undeniable chorus. "I can do whatever I want, Emily, and what I want is you." She needed to get away, to breathe, to think. She needed a way out. But no matter where she looked, all she could see was his intense gaze, the way he watched her as if he already knew the answer. She desperately refused to admit. Emily walked to her office without truly noticing the people around her. She grabbed her things quickly and left without saying a word to anyone. She couldn't deal with this right now. It was already nighttime when she realized she had been wandering aimlessly for almost an hour. Her legs were tired, her mind was racing, but no answer seemed satisfying. She stepped into a quiet cafe, ordered a strong coffee, and sat by the window, watching the city outside. Emily had never been the kind of person to give in easily to anything or anyone. She had always been rational, always put her career and independence above everything else. And then Brian Fisher came along. He challenged her, provoked her, made her feel things she didn't want to feel. And now he had torn down the last barrier she had used as an excuse to keep him away. What if I weren't your investor? What would you do? She closed her eyes and gripped her cup tightly. Emily knew the answer, but admitting it was another story. By the time she got home, it was past 11. The apartment was dark, silent. She tossed her bag onto the couch and let out a long sigh. Her phone vibrated. She picked it up, and when she saw the name on the screen, her heart pounded. Brian Fisher. Emily hesitated for a moment. She could ignore it, pretend she didn't see it, but then she noticed something that made her freeze. It wasn't a message. It was a call. He was calling. She swallowed hard before answering. Emily. His voice was deep, steady, and more than ever filled with hidden intentions. What is it, Brian? She tried to sound indifferent, but her voice wavered slightly. Can we talk? Emily closed her eyes, trying to maintain control. We've talked enough at work. I'm not talking about work. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken meaning. Emily felt her chest tighten. I don't know if I can deal with this right now. Then tell me when. She had no answer. Brian sighed softly on the other end of the line. I'll see you tomorrow then, Brian. Good night. Emily. The call ended before she could protest. She stared at her phone for a while, her breathing unsteady. And in that moment, she realized something that was both terrifying and inevitable. She didn't want to run. She wanted to see him. The next day started like any other, or at least Emily tried to pretend it did, but with each passing minute, her anxiety grew, a knot tightening in her stomach. Because she knew Brian would come for her, and he never did anything halfway. By the time the clock struck 6, Emily was already gathering her things to leave. She needed to go home, step away from everything, clear her head. But as soon as she stepped out of the office, Brian was already there. He was leaning against his sleek car, dressed in a flawless suit, with that intense gaze that was impossible to ignore. Emily stopped in her tracks, rooted to the spot. Are you really going to pretend you didn't see me? He asked, not moving, his voice a low rumble. She took a deep breath before stepping forward, conceding the moment. What do you want, Brian? He opened the car door, a silent invitation. Get in. I'm not. Emily closed her eyes, knowing there was no point in fighting it. She wanted to go, but admitting that was another matter. So in silence, she got into the car. They drove without speaking, the tension between them palpable. A hum in the enclosed space. Brian didn't say where they were going, but Emily knew he was heading to his penthouse, and for the first time, she didn't argue. The car stopped, and Brian stepped out first, opening her door with a quiet click. Emily hesitated for a second before finally getting out. The elevator ride was silent, a deliberate quietude, and when the doors opened, Brian led her into the spacious living room of his penthouse. Emily couldn't stop looking at him. Every little detail about this man, his effortless confidence, made her uneasy yet undeniably drawn. He took off his jacket, unbuttoned the top of his shirt, and grabbed 2 glasses of wine, handing one to her. She took it and drank a sip, trying to ignore the fact that he was dangerously close. Why am I here? She finally asked, her voice a whisper. Brian studied her for a moment before answering, his gaze intense. Because you didn't want to run. Her heart pounded, a frantic drum against her ribs. And what if this all goes wrong? He took a step closer, closing the last remaining distance between them. And what if it goes right? Emily swallowed hard. Every rational part of her told her to leave, to run while she still could. But she couldn't lie to herself anymore. She wanted him. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. The fear, the doubts, the years of self-preservation, it all disappeared when Brian cupped her face and kissed her. And Emily knew right then there was no turning back. Brian's kiss was everything Emily had feared and wanted at the same time. It was intense, confident, without hesitation, as if he had always known this moment would come sooner or later, and she, who had fought against this for so long, couldn't resist any more. She wanted him. Brian pulled her closer, one hand resting on her waist, while the other gently held her face, tilting it just so. Emily felt her mind go blank, her hands gripping his shoulders as if she needed something solid to hold on to. Time seemed to stop, suspended in that electrifying connection. But then reality hit her like a cold wave. What was she doing? Her breathing was uneven, her heart racing frantically in her chest. Emily pulled back suddenly, pushing Brian away just enough to break the searing contact. I can't. Brian stood perfectly still for a moment, watching her. He didn't look surprised. If anything, it seemed like he had expected this reaction. Why? He asked quietly, his voice a low rumble. Emily ran a hand over her face, feeling completely torn, her emotions a chaotic mess. This can't happen, Brian. He took a step back, but his eyes never left hers, holding her captive. Give me a real reason. Emily tried to organize her thoughts, to find a logical explanation, but everything inside her was too much of a jumble. This is crazy. It's not normal. And what's normal? He countered, his voice challenging. She clenched her jaw, frustrated, desperation tinging her words. If I give in, then what? What happens next? Brian crossed his arms, his expression perfectly composed, unreadable. We figure it out together. She let out a humorless laugh, a sharp, choked sound. Just like that? Just like that. He stepped closer again, and she felt a tightness in her chest. I can't. Brian only nodded slowly, a profound sadness in his eyes. But what he said next shook her even more. I won't force you, Emily. But stop lying to yourself. She held her breath, the silence between them stretching on, heavy with unspoken truths. Then she turned and walked away, not daring to look back, but knowing that everything had changed forever. The days that followed were a real test of endurance. Emily avoided Brian at the office as much as she possibly could. She kept her answers short and clipped during meetings, avoided eye contact at all costs, and even stayed a few minutes late just to make sure she wouldn't run into him. But he didn't make it easy. Brian didn't push for direct conversations, but he also didn't hide the fact that he was waiting for her, his patient, unwavering gaze following her every move. Every time their eyes met, Emily felt the same intense inner conflict, and it was tearing her apart. Until one night, everything finally collapsed. Emily was leaving the office late. She had been reviewing some project blueprints and had lost track of time. By the time she finally gathered her things and stepped out, the building was almost empty, only a few security lights dimly illuminating the hallway. And then, as soon as she turned the corner, there he was. Brian stood near the parking lot exit, leaning casually against his car, as if he knew she would appear at that exact moment. Emily froze for a second. She thought about ignoring him and walking away, just like she had been doing. But she knew she couldn't, because deep down, she wanted to see him. She wanted to hear his voice. She was tired of fighting this. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, a silent surrender, before making a decision. She walked toward him, her steps slow but deliberate. Are you waiting for me? Brian raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile playing on his lips, but didn't look surprised. What do you think? She let out a heavy sigh, a mixture of exasperation and resignation. "Brian, get in the car." Emily crossed her arms. "And what if I say no?" He simply smiled, a knowing, confident smile that infuriated her, yet thrilled her. "You won't." She clenched her jaw, frustrated by how certain he seemed, but deep down, she knew he was right. Emily got in the car. Brian walked around to the driver's side, got in, and started the engine. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice quiet. "You already know." And she did. Brian's apartment was just as she remembered, impeccable, organized, and effortlessly elegant. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the fact that she wasn't trying to run away anymore. Maybe it was the fact that for the first time, she truly wanted to be there. Brian took off his jacket, unbuttoned the top of his shirt, and turned to her. "Emily?" She lifted her eyes to him, not looking away this time, allowing herself to meet his intense gaze fully. "Say it." He stepped closer, stopping just near enough for her to feel the warmth of his presence, the subtle scent of his cologne. "What do you want?" His voice was calm and steady, but it sent a shiver through her, a delicious tremor. Emily didn't answer right away because she already knew what she wanted. She had known from the very beginning, and now there were no more excuses, no more walls left to build. "I want you." Brian smiled slowly, a genuine, breathtaking smile that reached his eyes. "Then stop running." She didn't reply, because for the first time, she didn't need to. And when Brian took her hand and gently pulled her closer, Emily knew there was no turning back. She had crossed the line between reason and desire, and she didn't regret it. The next morning, Emily woke up to the soft morning light filtering through the curtains. It took a few seconds for her to process where she was. The spacious bedroom, the crisp sheets, the faint, lingering scent of wood and cologne in the air. Then she remembered. She turned slowly and saw Brian Fisher still asleep beside her. He lay on his side, his breathing deep and steady, completely at ease, a picture of peaceful slumber. Unlike her. Emily couldn't relax. What had she done last night? The answer was obvious, but the real question was, what did it mean now? She carefully slipped out of bed, gathering her clothes from the floor. Her movements were slow, deliberate, trying desperately not to wake him. She needed a moment to think. But just as she picked up her blouse and started putting it on, she heard his voice behind her. "Running away again?" Emily froze. She turned slowly and found Brian awake, watching her with that intense gaze. He was propped against the pillow, the sheets resting at his waist, his dark hair slightly mussed in a way that was frustratingly attractive. She swallowed hard. "I'm not running." Brian raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Then why does it look like you're trying to leave without waking me?" Emily clenched her teeth. "Because I needed a moment to think." He was quiet for a moment, just watching her, as if trying to read her thoughts. Then he sighed. "Emily." She hesitated. "Brian." "Emily." He held out his hand, an open invitation. She knew that if she took it, there would be no more excuses, no more turning back. But before she could change her mind, she stepped forward and placed her hand in his. Brian pulled her back onto the bed, his eyes locked on hers, unwavering. "Do you regret it?" Emily took a deep breath. She should, logically, but she didn't. "No." Brian's lips curved into a small, relieved smile. "Then stop overthinking." She wished she could, but the truth was, her mind was a mess, a whirlwind of emotions. "What now?" she asked softly. Brian ran a finger along her cheek, tracing an invisible path, his touch sending a tremor through her. Now, we see where this takes us. Emily held his gaze, because for the first time, she realized Brian was just as caught up in this as she was. And that scared her even more. In the days that followed, Emily and Brian fell into an unspoken rhythm, a routine neither of them explicitly defined, but both intuitively understood. At work, they maintained the same professional posture as always. No touches, no lingering looks, no overt sign that anything had changed between them. But it had, profoundly, and the tension between them, the unspoken connection, only grew stronger each day. Every time they were alone in the office, Emily could feel the electricity in the air, a silent hum of desire. Every conversation felt loaded with unspoken intentions. Every glance felt like a shared secret. And at night, they couldn't stay away from each other. It was as if something invisible kept pulling them back again and again, until one day it simply wasn't enough anymore. Emily was at her desk reviewing the final adjustments to the Richmond Tower project when her phone vibrated. She picked it up and saw a short message. "Brian, come to my office." She frowned. An unexpected meeting. She put away her papers, grabbed her tablet, and walked down the hallway, trying not to look suspicious, trying to maintain her professional facade. But as soon as she stepped into his office and closed the door behind her, she realized this wasn't just another meeting. Brian was standing by the window, hands in his suit pockets, looking out at the city below. He looked tense, his usual composure strained. Emily shut the door behind her and crossed her arms, a sense of foreboding settling in her stomach. "What is it?" Brian turned slowly. And in that moment, she knew something was wrong, something significant. "We need to talk, Emily." He never started a conversation like that. "About what?" Brian took a step closer, his gaze intense. "About us." Her stomach twisted into a knot. "What about us?" He took a deep breath, a rare sign of vulnerability, as if choosing his words carefully. "This is becoming more serious than I expected." Emily's chest tightened, a cold knot forming in her stomach. "And is that a problem?" Brian didn't answer right away, and that silence was enough for her to understand. A bitter taste filled her mouth. "Do you want to end this, Brian?" He ran a hand through his hair, a clear sign of frustration, of internal turmoil. "I don't know." She stepped back, the space between them suddenly vast. "You don't know." He looked directly at her, his eyes full of conflict, a desperate battle raging within him. "Emily, you know I'm not the kind of guy who gets involved." Her chest ached, a sharp, piercing pain. "Then why did you start this?" Brian said nothing, his silence deafening. And at that moment, Emily realized something devastating. She was completely invested in this, and in him. He still wasn't sure. Emily let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head, a desperate attempt to ward off the pain. "You say you're not the kind of guy who gets involved, but here you are. Involved." Brian clenched his jaw, as if he wanted to disagree, to protest, but couldn't. Emily sighed, trying to ignore the growing pain inside her, the crushing weight of disappointment. "If you're telling me this now, Brian, it's because you've already made up your mind." He said nothing, his gaze fixed, unwavering. And that hurt more than any words ever could. Emily wasn't the kind of woman who begged. She wouldn't change who she was for anyone. So she did the only thing she could. She took a step back, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. All right. Brian looked surprised, a flicker of shock in his eyes. Emily, you don't have to say anything else, I understand. She turned and walked out before he could see the tears forming in her eyes, before he could see how utterly broken she was. Emily didn't go home that night. She walked around the city for hours, an aimless wanderer, trying to find a way not to feel what she was feeling, to escape the crushing weight of heartbreak. But it was impossible. She had fallen in love with Brian Fisher, and now she had to move on without him, because in the end, he was never truly ready for her. Emily didn't go to work the next day. She spent the night staring at the ceiling, trying to find any way to make the ache in her chest disappear, to quiet the tumultuous storm within her. But there was no easy solution. She had made the mistake of falling for Brian Fisher, and now was trying to get out before it was too late for him. The problem was, for her, it was already too late. The next morning, she sent a message to HR letting them know she needed a day off. Then she turned off her phone and refused to look at it for the rest of the day. She needed space, distance, time to mend. When the second day without Emily at work began, Brian knew he had made a profound mistake. He had spent the night sleepless, replaying every single word of their conversation. I'm not the kind of guy who gets involved. The look Emily gave him in that moment haunted him, a searing image in his mind. Because it wasn't true. He was involved. More than he should be, more than he wanted to admit, more than he had ever been in his life. He had become what he feared most, vulnerable and utterly unmoored. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do about it. By late afternoon, Emily heard the doorbell ring. She frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone, but as soon as she opened the door, her heart stopped. Brian Fisher was standing there, hands in his coat pockets, his eyes intense and determined, unwavering. She gripped the door tightly, ready to shut it immediately. No, she said flatly, her voice barely a whisper. Brian didn't back away, his stance resolute. Can we talk? I have nothing to say to you. But I have something to say to you. She clenched her teeth, a wave of familiar frustration washing over her. I've already heard enough, Brian. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. I was wrong. Emily felt a tightness in her chest, a sudden flicker of hope, but didn't give in. Yes, you were. He looked at her, and for the first time, he seemed truly vulnerable, stripped bare. Emily, I'm a man who doesn't deal well with emotions. That's never been part of my life. I never needed it. She rolled her eyes, a cynical laugh escaping her. Oh, good for you. Now tell me, what does that have to do with me? It has everything to do with you, because you changed everything. She opened her mouth to reply, but no words came out. His intensity, his raw honesty, stole her breath. I wanted to walk away before it got worse, but the truth is, it already has. Emily held her breath, her heart pounding. What do you mean by that? Brian did the last thing she expected. He stepped forward, cupped her face in his hands, and whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm in love with you. She froze completely, her mind reeling. What? He looked at her with all the honesty in the world, his blue eyes shimmering with a vulnerability she had never seen. I'm in love with you, Emily, and I'm completely lost in it. Emily's heart pounded, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs, because she never imagined hearing those words from Brian Fisher. But then she realized something even more terrifying, more exhilarating. She didn't want him to be lost. She wanted to find him. Emily took a deep breath and held his hands, squeezing them tight. "Then stop running, Brian." He didn't answer. He just moved closer, closing the last remaining space between them, and kissed her. And this time, neither of them pulled away. The kiss between Emily and Brian wasn't like the others. This time there was no more uncertainty, no more running. It was real, final. Brian held her tightly as if afraid she would disappear, while Emily felt her heart racing in her chest, a symphony of newfound hope. She never imagined he would say those words. "I'm in love with you." Those words echoed in her mind, a beautiful, resonant truth, and all she could do was kiss him back with all the intensity, all the pent-up emotion she had. When they finally pulled away, Brian rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, as if savoring the moment, etching it into his memory. "This time," he whispered, his voice raspy, "I'm not letting you go." Emily smiled softly, her heart overflowing with happiness, a lightness she hadn't known possible. "And what if I say, I don't want to go?" Brian opened his eyes and looked at her, something new and intense shining in them, a profound promise. "Then there's nothing in this world that can stop me from making you mine." The months that followed were the happiest of Emily's life. She and Brian finally accepted what they felt, embracing the whirlwind of their unexpected connection. And even though working together remained a challenge, a constant, playful dance of professional boundaries and personal desires, they learned to balance it. On tense meeting days, they argued passionately about contracts and deadlines, their intellects sparking against each other. On quiet nights, they shared intimate dinners, deep laughter, and stolen kisses in the kitchen of his penthouse. And for the first time, Emily felt truly complete, truly seen. She loved him deeply, unconditionally. And Brian, a man who had always been controlled, rational, and seemingly afraid of emotions, learned to love her in the deepest, truest way possible, opening his guarded heart completely. But he knew something was still missing, a final, crucial step. And he had a plan for that. That night, Brian took Emily out for a special dinner. They had been together for almost a year, and she sensed something in the air, a different kind of anticipation. But she had no idea what was truly about to happen. The restaurant had a private terrace bathed in soft, warm lights that twinkled like scattered stars. The atmosphere was elegant and intimately romantic, and Emily's heart raced when she noticed Brian seemed more nervous than usual. "Are you okay?" she asked with a gentle smile, a hint of concern in her voice. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued, a playful retort forming on her lips. But before she could say another word, Brian stood up from his chair. Emily frowned, confused. "Brian, what are you—" But her voice died in her throat the moment he got down on one knee. Emily felt the world stop, an abrupt, stunning halt. The restaurant around them disappeared, the gentle murmur of conversations, the soft clinking of glasses, the lights, the other people. Everything faded, dissolving into a hazy background. Everything except for Brian Fisher kneeling before her, holding an open velvet box with a stunning, sparkling ring inside. His eyes were filled with raw, overwhelming emotion, but his voice was steady and certain when he finally spoke. "Emily Carter," he began, his voice a low, heartfelt rumble. "I never planned for this. I never imagined I'd be here on one knee, asking someone to share the rest of my life with me." Emily felt tears burn in her eyes, a rush of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. But then you came along," Brian continued, a soft, tender smile gracing his lips, "and turned my world upside down. You made me feel things I never thought I could. You made me want something I never knew I needed." She covered her mouth with her hands, a futile attempt to hold back the cascade of emotions, the joyous tears. "I love you, Emily. And I want to spend every single day of my life with you. I want to laugh with you, fight over silly things, travel the world, and come home knowing you'll always be there." He held her hand firmly, looking deeply into her eyes, his gaze unwavering, full of unwavering promise. "So, will you marry me?" Emily let out a breathless laugh, tears spilling freely down her face, glistening in the soft lights. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes!" The restaurant erupted in applause, a wave of joyful sound, as Brian, his own eyes shining, slid the ring onto her finger. Then he stood up, pulling her into a deep, passionate kiss. A kiss filled with promises, with relief, with a future stretching out before them. And in that moment, Emily knew there was no fear in the world strong enough to keep them apart. They belonged to each other. Forever. The day was perfect. The sky was an endless, vibrant blue. The breeze was gentle, a soft caress against her skin, and the sun shone softly, warming the morning with its golden embrace. Emily could hardly believe this day had finally come. She wore a stunning white gown with delicate lace that hugged her figure, a masterpiece of elegance, and a long veil that flowed gracefully to the floor, shimmering with every step. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, revealing the delicate curve of her neck, and her hands trembled slightly as she held a bouquet of pristine white flowers. Inside the hall, the guests were gathered, a sea of smiling faces, waiting for the most anticipated moment. But to Emily, only one person in that crowd truly mattered, truly held her universe in his gaze. And he was right there, waiting for her. Brian stood at the altar, dressed in a flawless suit, a paragon of refined masculinity. But that wasn't what truly caught her attention. It was the way he looked at her, his eyes brimming with a profound tenderness, as if she was the most precious, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Emily bit her lip, holding back tears of overwhelming joy, and began walking down the aisle. With each step, her heart pounded faster, a joyful rhythm in her chest. And then, when she finally stood beside him, Brian took her hand and whispered softly, his voice full of awe, "You look beautiful." She smiled, a radiant, tearful smile, and then the officiant began the ceremony. Every word spoken felt more meaningful than anything else in the world, resonating deep within her soul. But the moment Emily had waited her whole life for, the moment that truly defined everything, came when the officiant asked, "Brian Fisher, do you take Emily Carter to be your wife, promising to love her, honor her, and stand by her side for all the days of your life?" Brian held her hand, tighter. His eyes shone with an uncontainable emotion, and his voice was steady but undeniably filled with feeling as he answered, "With all my heart, yes." Emily felt a lump form in her throat, a joyous constriction, and when the officiant turned to her, she thought her chest might burst with happiness. "Emily Carter, do you take Brian Fisher to be your husband, promising to love him, honor him, and stand by his side for all the days of your life?" She took a deep, shaky breath, looking at the man who had changed her life in every conceivable way, who had turned her structured world delightfully upside down. And then she smiled, a radiant, all-encompassing smile, pouring every ounce of her joy into the simple word. "Yes, yes, forever, yes." Brian let out a quiet laugh, his eyes brimming with love, mirroring her own. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Before the officiant could even finish the sentence, Brian pulled Emily close, wrapping his arms around her waist, crushing her gently against him, and kissed her deeply, passionately, irrevocably. The guests erupted in cheers and applause, a wave of joyful sound filling the hall. She laughed against his lips, feeling happier, more complete than she ever thought possible.